What is this thing? It's an Atari. My coworker says that for the first 5 out of 10 years of his life, Atari is what you called all boxes that you plug into your TV to play any games. There were other game consoles around at the time, but the Atari 2600 was so well designed and marketed that it became the name for its category, just like the likes of Jell-O or Band-Aids. Before 1982, it was simply known as the Atari VCS, or Video Computer System. But linking the huge marketing campaign of the 2600 to the Atari made the name 2600 almost as much of an icon. Hey guys, it's Jacob with Tech Retrospective. Today we are going to be taking a look at the first version of this console to actually be called the 2600. There were 3 other versions before this one, and many variations after it. And all official versions are 100% compatible with each other, which makes our job simpler. But you might be asking yourself what there could possibly be to say about something most gamers and people over 30 already know pretty well. It's a challenge, but we think we're up to it, especially since most people don't really stop to consider what makes an icon an icon. What does a company have to do to make everyone stop what they're doing and look with optimistic anticipation? What did people bring into their homes in the 1970s that would make them sit in front of a glowing box for hours upon hours eating pizza and popcorn, accomplishing absolutely nothing and wanting to do nothing but keep sitting there? Okay, well, what new legal thing? The real 2600 story doesn't begin with disco balls or Star Wars or Reggie Jackson. It goes all the way back to the end of the Vietnam War, Watergate, $11,000 houses, and the Flip Wilson show. Atari knew how to create iconic products right out of the gate. The first commercial arcade video game, Computer Space, was introduced in 1971. It was designed by Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney, with Nutting Associates, a California-based company known for their mechanical game, Computer Quiz, handling manufacturing. In 1972, the pair left Nutting and renamed their design company, Syzygy Engineering, to Atari, a phrase coming from the Japanese game Go, a personal favorite of Dabney and Bushnell's. Nobody knew what a video game arcade was back then, but Atari's first product was the watershed release of Pong in 1972, in the form of a full-sized arcade game housed in a wood grain and yellow cabinet. Ah, the aesthetics of the 70s. Gameplay was generated by TTL since computers and memory were not refined or cost-effective enough for recreational gaming at the time. The graphics were generated by switching the beam of a black and white CRT on and off during the scan cycle. So there were no colors or even shades of gray, just full black or full white. The sound was equally as primitive, being composed of simple beeps or clicks. The first version of Pong didn't even have a coin slot. Ridiculous as that all sounds, arcades as we know them didn't exist. Before Pong, pinball would have been the closest thing to an arcade game, and people loved it. With the success of Pong, Atari created a home version which users could plug directly into their TV sets. The home version used much of the same logic as the full-size arcade game, but chips were designed to turn a complex mess of wires into a small, inexpensive, easily installed package. It was a tough sell at first, but the Pong home version was eventually released by Sears in 1975. Atari was already taking considerable steps to develop home games. They recognized that computer technology would soon play a major part in the industry, and there was a problem they hoped the computer technology would help them solve. The problem was that the expected marketing lifespan of a home video game was less than the time it took to develop the hardware. Imagine it, spending the equivalent of, say, $450 on a game and everyone in the house plays it for 2 weeks and then gets sick of it, and it's useless. This prompted Atari to consider a completely new architecture, the CPU-ROM cartridge console. If you know your video game history, you may be saying to yourself, Atari didn't invent the first cartridge-based home console to hit the market, and you'd be correct. But ask around and see if you can find anyone who owned a Fairchild Channel F in the 70s. The reality is that both Fairchild and Atari were working on the same concept at the same time, but the two companies took very different approaches to the technology they used in their respective systems. To make a long story short, Fairchild started out with an Intel 8080 based system, but rejected it based on the high production costs. They then switched to a processor and chipset design of their own, which had the advantage of being less expensive to produce and quicker to market, but ultimately limited the system's performance. The Fairchild Channel F was definitely something nobody had seen before, but a direct comparison between it and Atari's eventual offering reveals that it fell a little short in terms of sound, graphics, resolution, color depth, and game selection. On top of that, even after abandoning the 8080 design, the Fairchild Channel F was still very expensive. Atari started out with expectations of building its console with off-the-shelf components, and it stuck to that plan. MOS Technology began its life selling the 6502 processor, which is a low-cost but compatible version of the Motorola 6800. The 6502 was designed specifically based on the assumption that inexpensive consumer-based computer systems would be the way of the future. In 1975, Atari was able to negotiate a price for the 6502 of just $8 per unit. It was soon determined that the many functions of the 6502 would be unnecessary for a small game console. As luck would have it, MOS created the 6507, which was nearly identical to the 6502, except for the 7 had 13 pins dedicated to memory addressing instead of the 16 pins of the 6502. In short, the CPU chipset combo used in Atari's console cost about $12. A Motorola or Intel-based combo with similar performance characteristics would have cost between $150 and $200. That's just for the CPU and chipset. Although price was a considerable advantage for the MOS hardware, using the somewhat scaled-down version of the CPU kept it from being a simple, straightforward decision. By modern standards, RAM and ROM were an absolute rip-off. 1 kilobyte of RAM in 1975 cost about as much, figuring for inflation, as 1 gigabyte of RAM these days. For game console developers, that means that if you can't afford to put enough memory in your system for a frame buffer, you have to resort to clever designs and programming to draw images while they're being created, by the same processor you need to draw them in the first place. Atari's handling of this problem would be the key to the success of its first home console. Jay Miner, known later as the father of the Commodore Amiga, was the architect of Atari's solution. It came in the form of an integrated chip called the Television Interface Adapter, or TIA. We could do an entire video on what the TIA does, but even that would be like writing a single-page instruction manual on performing brain surgery. But the process the TIA uses became known as racing the beam. Racing the beam is basically performing all game processing associated with a frame of gameplay in the time it takes for the electron gun in a CRT to end its current frame of the lower right corner of the screen and travel back to the upper left to begin the next frame. Closely linking gameplay processing with the cycles of a CRT obviously created the need for some substantial timing and fast I/O facilities. The Atari console uses the MOS 6532 or Riot chip. The RAM input-output timer was an 8-bit chip with 2 digital bidirectional I/O ports, 128 bytes of RAM, and a timer. One port on the Riot chip was used specifically to handle the directional input from the joystick controllers. The other port handled information from the 6 switches on the console. The fire buttons were handled directly by the TIA. In a nutshell, this all means that the way Atari games handle video is determined by the game programmers and not by the architecture of the game console. This makes game programming very difficult, but offers flexibility and performance advantages. Game programmers had the use of 1 playfield, 2 player sprites, 2 missile sprites, and 1 ball sprite to work with. The TIA offered them a palette of 128 colors in NTSC and 108 colors in PAL. Since the details of video configuration were handled at the programming level, individual games had to be ported either for 60 Hz NTSC or 50 Hz PAL. As experienced retro gamers are aware, the TIA can also make it hard to get a good picture out of modern televisions and digital devices, mostly because the system was specifically designed to work with the types of televisions being manufactured in the late 70s. In modern terms, the TIA might seem like a compromise or a shortcut, but at the time it allowed Atari's console to define the state of the art. Memory for games and the processing power to address it were in short supply, and even though the ROM carts held the code and a small amount of RAM in them, the 13-bit addressing of the 6507 must have made game development seem like trying to juggle with your hands tied behind your back. Even so, early game programmers figured out how to make it work in dramatic fashion. Clever use of bank switching, the CPU bus, and memory mapping allowed cartridges to store 512K ROM and 32K RAM. Over time, programmers learned how to use extended logic to allow for as much as 128K of RAM on a single cart, although 64K appears to be as far as anyone took things. One important aspect of the Atari console's success is one that didn't impact its performance. The home version of Pong was so popular when it came out that it was quickly cloned. Consumer computer-related intellectual property laws hadn't been defined yet, so Atari gets the credit for inventing it, but it wasn't the sort of moneymaker you'd think it would have been. To prevent this from happening with the new console, Atari successfully negotiated with IC manufacturers to prevent them from selling to its competitors. As a result, clones didn't begin to appear for many years, allowing Atari to keep its momentum going while it responded to the market. The first working prototype was codenamed Stella. Atari experienced some minor delays before it was finally released in November 1977 as the VCS or Video Computer System. This initial version would later be known as the Heavy Sixer due to its thick, heavy outer shell and the fact that it still had all 6 external switches located on the top of the console. In the UK, it became known as the Woody for its wood grain side panels. The VCS came bundled with the CX-10 joystick and the CX-30 rotary paddle. 1 year later, the CX-10 was replaced by the CX-40. Sears also negotiated with Atari to offer the VCS as the Sears Video Arcade, under its Telegames brand. The following year, Atari moved manufacturing of the VCS from Sunnyvale, California to Hong Kong. Changes were made to its exterior, making it less expensive to produce and lighter. This one was called, you guessed it, the Light Sixer. Around this time, Atari released the CX-50 keyboard controller. There was also the CX-23 Kids keyboard controller. In 1979, Atari and Activision had a court battle over rights to produce third-party games for the VCS. Activision was actually founded by 4 former Atari VCS programmers, and their games are regarded by many as the best you can get. In 1980, another version of the VCS was released. It was identical to the Light Sixer, except for the difficulty switches were moved to the back of the console. This version would become known as the VCS 4-switch. The 2600, like ours, began its life in 1982. It's commonly called the Darth Vader edition due to its black exterior. Apart from that, it's identical to the VCS 4-switch. In 1983, Atari released the 2800 in Japan. It had 4 controller ports rather than the 2 of the 2600. The controllers themselves were an all-in-one configuration, which made them quite unique. Apart from that, the case was also different from the 2600. It was a wedge design which inspired the later 7800's exterior. The final official version of the VCS was known as the 2600 Junior. Specs-wise, it was just like the 2600 but employed lower-cost manufacturing, which eventually gave it the reputation for technical problems. However, it did cost less than $50 in '86 when it was released, which is about $129 today. It was offered in several stylized versions. Some standout titles for the 2600 are Adventure, considered by most to be the first true action-adventure game, Pitfall, Activision's most iconic game from the era, and the infamous Pac-Man and E.T., the Extraterrestrial, which are both cited as having directly caused the video game crash of 1983. We found our 2600 for 80 bucks. It appears to be in pretty good condition, and it came with controllers and a good sized pile of games to get us started. For its light feel, the plastic exterior is surprisingly rugged and holds up pretty well. While it's pretty obvious what it is, the branding for the 2600 appears on the front edge of the console. The top contains the VCS name along with the switches for power, color black and white selection, game selection, and game reset. This is also where the cartridge slot is located. On the back is where you'll find the DC power connector, the controller ports, the TV channel switch, and each player's difficulty level. Now we're going to give the system some ratings. Most people know this system pretty well, so the values are pretty subjective, but we'll try to keep this as objective as possible. Rarity gets a 2 out of 5. Over its lifetime, the Atari 2600 sold about 30 million units. That number doesn't count the numerous flashback devices released in modern times, but you'll have no problem finding this console at your local game store. Price gets a 3 out of 5. The 2600 tends to hold on to some of its value, however, they also hold up well, so you're likely to get your money's worth. It's worth noting that the vast majority of 2600 games are extremely cheap due to a pretty drastic oversupply. Aesthetics. If you're looking at the original 2600 releases with the classy 70s wood grain, I'd probably give the 2600 a 4 out of 5. This all-black unit here is sleek, but it's not nearly as iconic. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5. Games. Games get a 4 out of 5. There are 500 official games for the 2600 and upwards of 10,000 if you count bootlegs and revisions. Convenience gets a 4 out of 5. These systems can be quite temperamental at times and only offer RF output without modifications or adapters, which is a pain. A nice convenience, though, is that the 9-pin controller port used by this system was carried on to many other systems, including the Sega Genesis. So you can have a wide variety of controllers to work with if you aren't a fan of the standard joystick. Well, thanks for watching this video covering the Atari 2600. We have dozens upon dozens of other consoles we're intending to cover in the future, so make sure to subscribe. Let us know in the comments down below what video you'd like to see next, and I'll see you guys next time.